Welcome to the Jeffrey Schnapp Telethon by now. You've been here for what, 5 days in a row? So it's a marathon, so I'm kind of amazed that he still have the energy to do one more. It has been great to have Jeffrey around these days in the school. He was here part of the master classes of the liberal art program that Tom Wiscon and Jack Matatayo put in place, which it presents a great opportunity, I think, for the students to be exposed to a much larger way to think and understand problems that somehow architecture always try to meddle with, sometimes with more or less success. But in looking at, and Jeffrey, I had the pleasure to know him for many years. In one of his previous phases, and I'll get to this one, he was in Stanford. It seems like burgundy color seems to be the color of the institution that you choose to be related somehow. Red and burgundy is in that ballpark. But I thought it's an interesting thing because I was thinking about what is a Renaissance man today, which I think Jeffrey's more like that. And I was looking at this quote of Frank Sinatra, which I always find really interesting. You only live once, and the way I live, once is enough. So I had the feeling that then Jeffrey is one of these guys who's trying to squeeze as much as he can in his own life. So he doesn't operate in a single frequency like many other people that we tend to know in the field of culture. And this is, to me, it's a very interesting issue because I think it's part of the conversation about what are the limits of architecture, what an architect is. And ultimately, there is these two words that appears very often when in anything Jeffrey is involved. We have to do with the idea of knowledge design, which it seems to me that this is a really interesting concept because it goes beyond any kind of limiting way to understand how we are cultural producers at the end of the day. And I think there are certain kind of canons that you can place. I mean, he's a cultural theorist, a media historian, designer, experimentalist. He creates things, he teaches. Right now he's the CEO of the Piaggio, what is the official name? I call it the Fast Forward thinking, which, of course, his partner in crime, Greg Lynn, is here as well. And this is all about exploration, about what are the territories and what constitute possibilities for design. But ultimately, one can think about what constitute how to live a contemporary life, how to think about what the contemporary city should be, contemporary culture, contemporary world. And it seems to me that more than ever in these times of confusion, at least in the political arena, it seems like it's fascinating and people are trying to keep thinking of the value of this and how these things intersect between innovation, culture, commerce, and how all these things can create new worlds and new possibilities how to operate. And there are very few people who have the capacity to operate in so many layers. So I don't know exactly what the Renaissance man will look today, but certainly will look very close, very, very close to what Jeffrey Schnapp is. So once again, I welcome you for the 5th time in so many days to speak to SCI-Arc once again. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Hernan, for that generous introduction. And one of the pleasures of this occasion for me is I'm going to try to do something that I've never tried to do before, which is integrate the work that Greg and I have been doing together in developing this company and a series of robotic vehicles under the label of Piaggio Fast Forward. We're part of the Piaggio group, with the work that I've carried out initially at Stanford under the aegis of the Stanford Humanities Lab, which is where I first met Hernan. Here at SCI-Arc, as a matter of fact, some collaborations emerged between my lab at Stanford and SCI-Arc that were super stimulating and productive from at least my standpoint. But now at MetaLab at Harvard, which is the research laboratory that I run inside the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society. About 5 or 6 years ago, the head of the Humanities Center at Rice University put together a conference on imaginary disciplines. And the invitation was to make up a discipline that you wish existed. And since I have spent much of my career moving between being a cultural historian, originally trained as a medievalist, later principally interested in 20th century culture with an emphasis on Italy, my interests, engagements of a curatorial sort, my interests in technology and experimental methods, all of those pieces, of course, create a kind of complexity that one needs to invent a story around. And so on that occasion, I started searching about for a label, an umbrella that would justify, create a kind of argument, spurious or real, for the convergence between all those different threads that sustain my interest. And I came up with this phrase, knowledge design. And so I've come to sort of believe that it is a discipline, or at least that it's a useful discipline for me. And how I conceive it is something like the following. As a field that essentially asks this question and tries to find answers speculatively, propositionally, and iteratively, what could or should knowledge look like in the 20th century? Questions like, where and how is it produced and activated and shared? Questions like, what are the most intriguing or engaging emergent forms, genres, and experiences that fall under this domain? And in particular, I mean, this is true of a lot of the work that I'm going to present today, just as an example of how I'm sort of exploring, finding my way through this imaginary field. What are the meaningful ways of bridging, building bridges, experiential, research-based, knowledge-based, between the digital realm and analog experience? So if the phrase means anything at all, what it means to me is basically three main domains, of which I'm hoping that I'll be able to serve up a rich set of propositions that, as illustrations too. The first is the exploration of new knowledge forms, genres, objects, experiences, and platforms. The second is the design of learning and knowledge spaces that somehow productively weave together information and space. Infrastructures, appliances for learning, as some of you may know, and I'll allude to this briefly, a lot of the work that I've done over the recent years has been focused on library design. Libraries sort of one piece at a time. The sort of library of the future, but built up at the level of appliances, pieces of furniture, policies, before even getting to the question of what a building or a knowledge learning space looks like. And third, and hopefully the projects that I'll show you tonight will sort of speak for themselves in this regard. The challenges that interest me most of all are ones that involve what I would describe, metaphorically at least, as the stitching of seams between things and thoughts, between information and space, between macro, meso, and micro scales of experience. The exploration of hybridities, of the most productive kinds of hybridities. And in the course of the projects that I'm going to be showing you, one could rightly assign them to information design or we could slice up the pie in many, many ways. Some of them involve book design, some are basically in the video graphic space, others involve interaction design, experience design. But in all of them, and this is why the phrase knowledge design has been productive for me at least, design serves as a kind of meta discourse. It's a kind of translational practice that allows for the exploration, the examination of these shifts in scale, these moves across media, this construction of seams between different media forms, between pixel and page and the like. So what I'm going to try to do in this talk is to bring together the kind of work that I do most typically at MetaLab. MetaLab is as I'll go into in a second, we often struggle with this issue of who are we? We are deliberately a meta lab in the sense that we don't position ourselves specifically as a kind of humanities or arts and humanities or digital humanities laboratory. We're engaged by a whole series of questions that have to do with emerging genres and forms, with questions that have to do precisely with productive couplings between the analog and the digital. We're particularly interested in the future of print, of what can we ask of print artifacts to do today that we couldn't yesterday? What are the promising avenues for exploring the position of print-based culture within the multi-channel world of communications that we occupy in this moment? Questions of storytelling, particularly storytelling on macro and micro scales, storytelling through databases, the use of the expressive and creative, imaginative, and critical use of data and data structures, work that focuses on expanding the sensorium of scholarly forms of knowledge. All of these are part of the sort of general areas that we pursue. On the other side of the fence, and I hope it isn't spurious to try to fold this in, there's the kind of work that Greg and I and some of our colleagues have been involved in, trying to think about the future of cities and the future of mobility. It's an area that I don't bring engineering expertise to. I bring my experience as a historian of culture who was writing a book, and still writing a book. It's the slowest book I've ever written, but it's a history of speed in human culture. But questions of mobility and intelligence have assumed a form today that a lot of these issues about building seams, about the place where the analog, where the embodied and the informational meet, are very, very pertinent to the sort of work that we're doing in vehicle design. They involve questions of how navigational intelligence could be linked across the space of human knowledge and the capabilities of machines and machine vision and machine sensing. They involve the whole issue of vehicle behaviors, of how vehicles as agents, particularly when they become robotic or endowed with autonomy, how they can communicate and promote trust when they are circulating in human-rich environments, or otherwise known as target-rich environments. In other words, where there are lots of obstacles, there's lots of movement, there's lots of complexity. Third of all, of course, is the question of interaction, of what are the productive ways in which robots can speak the language of humans and humans learn the language of robots, that they can communicate in an interspecies mode, if you like. And last but not least, and a lot of the work that we've been doing really is focused on conceptualizing what this space, this emerging culture of mobility might be, and how the vehicles that we develop could, in a sense, create and enable this future model of granular urbanism, as we like to refer to it, to come about. So at MetaLab, we call ourselves an idea foundry, a knowledge design lab, and a production studio. And that's a bit of a mouthful, but it's a mouthful that is meant to replace what many people would have labeled us as, either as a media lab or as a kind of arts and humanities lab. We kind of like this combination because what we think of ourselves as being in the business of is really doing the high risk, beta testing of ideas that are emerging ideas about, or concepts of new genres of practice, new forms of research, new methodologies, and new models of communicating research outcomes. We're a knowledge design lab in the sense that we are a research center, largely run by a group of researchers with humanities backgrounds or arts backgrounds, with creative technologists as our sort of engineering peers. And we're a production studio. We make stuff. We like to theorize, but we like to theorize largely in the form of active propositions that you can agree with or disagree with when you stand in front of them. But all of this work is in some way addressing this question. As I said, we come from humanities backgrounds, the bulk of us, which is what are these new and emergent forms of humanistic knowledge, but knowledge writ large? Knowledge in all fields has been undergoing a kind of transformation in all kinds of fundamental ways that have to do not only with how it's produced, but how it's disseminated, received, distributed, and the like. So all of our work essentially works along the lines of these genres, of emerging genres, experimenting with them iteratively, and grappling with the ways in which they enable us to do certain things that seem to us engaging or interesting. And the examples I'm going to show you today mostly illustrate some form of this mantra, which is that data is the defining material of the 21st century. It's the stuff that we have to make other stuff out of, in a sense. It no longer belongs to the realm of institutions or to the realm of pure statistics or research. It's now the stuff of experience. But it's stuff that doesn't do anything unless you work with it. It has a kind of materiality to it. It has to be architected. It has to be crafted, and it has to be shaped. And that shaping process is essential to all fields, the humanities, arts and humanities included. So a lot of our work is really focused on this question of crafting data in expressive, critical, and creative ways. And I'll show you some examples of the sort of work that can lead to. I'm going to look at three large sort of clusters of work, and those involve what I was just alluding to, expressive, critical uses of data. The second is the future of print, or the present and future of print, modeling new approaches to how print functions as a channel within the kind of information ecology of the present. And the third is the question of forms of aesthetic experience, or cultural experience, you might say, on unfamiliar scales. Ways in which we can use databases to structure, to frame experiences of the world of artworks, for example, that enhance or deepen those experiences. And I should underscore in the course of this presentation that all of these are projects that are collaborative projects. So these aren't necessarily my projects. I want to underscore the importance of teamwork. The lab for us is a structure that implies the workshop, if you like, a place where there's a lot of distributed expertise and labor that goes into responding to the questions that these projects try to tackle. So the one I want to start with is how can a complex multi-layered story be told by means of data? And the example I'm going to use is an example of, it's a kind of quirky, slightly quirky example perhaps, but one that I think is interesting, and it was a series of workshops that MetaLab ran for the Getty Trust in 2014 and 2015. And one of the questions we were interested in for these workshops was, in a sense, the question that interested the Getty in the first place in engaging us to run these workshops. These were workshops directed at young museum professionals and art historians, trying to, in a sense, create for them rich experiences of how working with these very, very powerful databases, from provenance databases to image databases, this whole toolkit of digital art history, of digital cultural history, to start using those tools in more creative, expressive, and imaginative ways. Not just simply as a set of reference tools, but rather as, in a sense, the foundations for a whole new set of opportunities and methodologies. So in the process of doing so, we thought it would be interesting to turn the workshops themselves into a database, in order to treat them as an opportunity to create a model of documentation that would itself be expressive or playful. So this is what we did in the case of the second workshop, and here you see an expression of that. So there were three big questions that the workshop was built around. What are problem collections? How do we make the invisible visible? And what are beautiful data? And each of these three is captured. This is essentially a representation of a 2-week workshop in the form of a database that allows you to look at that event thickly documented from these three different perspectives, but then with a series of other subcategories that allow you to dive deeper from the surface of the event into the actual building blocks that made it up. Those building blocks are people, they are themes, they're ideas, they're artworks, they're curatorial projects, they're the whole layering or the texture of all of those taken together. So here we're looking at one of the three views that's available to the viewer. You're looking at essentially what are a series of like card catalogs, everything from name tags to little notes and so forth. That same data set can be looked at instead. This is our series of raw JSON files. where we're looking at the same data, we're just looking at it from different angles with a different set of graphic conventions being used. And here, what you can see is, of course, how data works, how relations are constructed. This is actually an active database. I can take any term and set up a series of search terms or cancel them out, as the case may be. Each of these is a record, and make my way through any of these subcategories: readings, insights, collections. And what we're seeing is how a database works, basically. It's architecture, so to speak. I can choose any set of terms and look at the way in which they create a series of network structures. And similarly, when we look at what beautiful data are, we can look at one of the many, many visualization tools. This is from the D3 library, in case you're a data visualization geek, where we can look at exactly that same data set, but instead in terms of a series of arc structures that show how those data are related to one another. So we can pick any element within the larger structure and follow it around. Now, obviously, the presumption here is not that, let me go back to my slide there, that in a sense, such a method answers all the questions, but it's simply meant as a playful, imaginative way to allow you to create a record of an event that has, of course, a complexity of different perspectives that are all gathered together that produce something, a corpus of records, a corpus of projects, a corpus of themes, and that unfold over time. And there's a number of other views we could have made available, but it's an example of the sort of approach to data that's typical of our work. So here's a second example. This is an example that's very much in progress, and I'm showing it to you in a super initial view. And this is a project called Curricule. Curricule answers the question of how a course catalog, that might seem like a really unpromising data set. You've all been exposed to course catalogs in the old print model where they were just inventories of courses that you as a student could choose from. You've been exposed to the digital equivalent, which essentially doesn't depart very much from that notion. So the question behind Curricule, it's a commissioned project that the School of Arts and Sciences asked us to undertake, was what if you could map a curriculum as a set of relations, not as a list of individual items? What if you could map it dynamically? And what if you could do so historically, so that it was literally a kind of interactive archive that both enabled current choices that students are making, but also allowed them to go on a kind of time travel back into the curriculum to see the history of an institution. It's a mode of institutional portraiture, you might say. And this is sort of the world we're all familiar with, or we were familiar with at the turn of the century. That's Harvard circa right over here, circa 1900, and that's what a database representation looks like that essentially extends that original model. So what would it be like if instead we were looking at a curriculum? This is a time slice for the spring. This is based on the data sets from the university for the spring of 2016, where every course is in some kind of relational structure. It's mapped, where you could look at it from the standpoint of chronology, bibliography. You could choose a theme. You could find any number of angles into the overall distribution of topics. Or if you were a student, for example, you could plot your own curriculum, your own curricle. A curricle is a kind of a coach of a kind of sports car version of a coach in the 19th century, in case you were wondering. Or similarly, we can actually look at historical data to show how certain forms of teaching proliferate in certain moments in the history of an institution. Much to our amazement and surprise, we discovered that Harvard actually has 100 years of curricular data. And what does a university produce if it isn't its curriculum? And yet, it's never really been possible to look at the curriculum as a whole, to view it as a kind of portrait of an institution and its practices. And I'm going to close this section by saying just a few words about archives again. The question of activating or animating archives has been essential to the work that I did at Stanford and have done since my arrival at Harvard. And one of the interesting challenges with archives is something we talked about a lot in the master class, is this problem of scale. As human beings, we're very good at grappling with data sets on a certain scale. When they exceed a certain scale, we begin to struggle. Our storytelling models, our argumentative models, are largely based on certain kinds of cognitive boundaries. And so when we enter the world of an archive, whether it's a paper archive or its digital descendants, we enter this world where we have to do a tremendous amount of filtering to begin to wrap boundaries around, to frame that which begins to be the kind of nascent argument, interpretation, story that we construct. And so one of the interesting affordances of the digital era is we now have such fingertip access to vast data sets, to vast corpora, archives of all kinds, from photographs to sound archives. What do we do with all of that? It's really easy to accumulate and to digitize, but actually to translate it into forms of practice is interesting. We don't even have genres in many cases. And so here's an example from, this is work of a colleague of mine, or two colleagues of mine, Yanni Loukissis, who's now at Georgia Tech, and Christelle Denis, who's a data visualization specialist. So this is an illustration from a publication. This is actually the publication of an archive. You're looking at an entire archive made up of, I think it's 17,200 and something records. Each of those little dots is a planting event. This is a representation of the history of the Arnold Arboretum. The Arnold Arboretum was a research space. It wasn't meant to be a public park in Boston. It was meant to be a park that curated the collection of tree samples from all over the world, created a kind of taxonomy that's literalized in the design of the landscape. And you can see the effort here was to visualize the entire archive of the Arboretum as a tree structure. In other words, to use the metaphorics of tree growth as a kind of analogy for the growth of a collection, the growth of an institution. And I'm only showing you one piece of this because I'm going to take you now to the actual publication. It's a publication, which is, I think, a good illustration of the kind of experimental work that we're interested in. So this is a publication where we have a second representation. The powerful thing about data sets is that they're so mutable. You can use data to tell multiple crisscrossing stories. You can create so many different points of entry. So here's another representation from the moment of foundation, 1872 to 2012, when our data sets end month by month. Those are your planting events, one by one. And in this case, there's an argumentative structure here on the right side. That's where the illustration was that you saw a little bit earlier. We'll get to it in a second. So this is a conventional argument about the history of the Arboretum, its record keeping, the nature of the archive, the nature of the events, certain anomalies in the data sets that we see. There we are. But the interesting thing is these are linked. So we have both this macro representation where every event is documented. There's a story down to the level of plants that no longer exist, but where there's a moment that was documented in the archive. And each of those is cross-linked to points in the argument. You can see that what we get in the right column here is our accessions, acts of accession. So as a kind of institutional portrait, this is a different kind of genre, if you like, of storytelling that isn't familiar to us because it goes so far beyond the conventions of standard historiography. Okay, so I want to turn now to, if PowerPoint will allow me to, okay, to the realm of books, the present and future of books. And the question here, I want to look at two examples. The second one is a bit of a double example, but the first is the question of what happens to all those genres? What could happen to those kinds of genres that we associate with the history of particularly the industrial phase of print culture? Are there interesting ways to use the digital platforms, tools, and technologies that have completely reshaped the world of print over the course of the last 50 years in more inventive and imaginative ways that allow us to do things that are interesting or engaging? The second example I'm going to look at has more to do with the generative use of print as a moment within a larger research process. But here, I'm going to take as the point of departure a work that falls into the most conventional kinds of models of scholarly work, which is the critical edition. But in this case, it's a critical edition of a work of radical pedagogy from the late 1960s, Blueprint for Counter-Education. I'm not sure how many of you will, for whom this will be a household title. But a Blueprint for Counter-Education was a work put together as part of a roadshow that was part of the Free University movement in the late 60s during the height of the counterculture. Its ambition was to create a portable, a kind of university in a box, a counter-university in a box that you could install in your bedroom in any space using 3 large posters. And those 3 large posters were put into a boxed set, which you see the original of here. It was published in 1970. It's probably the only such sort of design-driven book that Doubleday ever published. And in this box set, there were these 3 posters that are wall-sized posters, and there was what was called the shooting script, which was a kind of instruction manual with a database attached to it. In fact, most of the shooting script is a set of tables of contents of books. It's exactly the way that a database would be structured today. And my collaborator, Adam Michaels from Project Projects, and I were fascinated by this object that we discovered in the course of some other work we were doing together. And we thought long and hard about what would it be to reprint. This is a very rare book today. It wasn't a rare book when it was published. It was published in about 5,000 copies. It was actually on display at the Museum of Modern Art as part of the famous Information Show in 1970. It was one of the documents that was used in that regard. And Adam and I struggled with this question of what would be a critical edition of a work that looks like this? We could just reprint it, but to reprint it with some kind of apparatus that would bring it into the present, bring it alive today, make it a blueprint that somehow dialogues with the debates over pedagogy, over education today, seemed like an interesting proposition. What we came up with, I think as you saw in that video clip, is a stealthy way of, we designed an additional book that slots in side by side with the shooting script. It looks like it belongs to the original, but in fact it's a critical apparatus. And part of the critical apparatus is a web support that was developed by my colleague, Jessica Yurkovsky, which allows you to go into the archive, so to speak, and actually see where Blueprint came from. It came from a kind of roadshow that Maury Stein and his collaborator, Larry Miller, developed. These are the original blueprints. Why blueprints? Blueprint machines were the largest printing devices that were available to people during this period. So if you wanted a wall-sized print for people to take home and use as the basis for forms of self-guided educational adventure, you needed to print them out as blueprints. So the website is a kind of archive that allows you not only to peel away these layers and see how they got from those original blueprints to the Mylars, then to the finalized posters, but also to peel them back and go into the archive, so to speak, and see how these objects were produced. And there's a whole other series of elements that make up the apparatus, but I think you get my point. The point is to create an experience that respects the integrity of the original object and at the same time takes us somewhere else. So here I come now to the case of the second example from the world of experimentation with print forms that addresses, in a sense, a different question, which is how can books function not as a point of arrival, print is no longer the medium of record in many, many domains of contemporary life, but rather as a generative node, and as a generative node within a larger structure. And the second feature of this that I'm going to show you just a brief snippet of is how even a video documentary, like a documentary film basically, can be reimagined also as a navigational system for an archive. In this case, all of these pieces are fit together in a book that my colleague Matthew Battles and I published entitled The Library Beyond the Book, but that spins itself off, sort of generated in turn, a database documentary entitled Cold Storage, about which I'll say something in a minute. Now, The Library Beyond the Book is an essay on how different moments from the past of the architecture of libraries could illuminate scenarios for the future of libraries. So it has this kind of double optic. And it's a book that is built around a backbone of essays about the different scenarios: the living mausoleum, the cloister, the database, what we call the accumul library, the programmable library, and libraries of the here and now. And then a series of micro-arguments, little windows that are inserted into the book. You can see how the book plays with these conventions of long forms and short forms. It is itself a kind of experiment. Here's an example of one of the windows. Here are the provocations that you find in the margins. Those provocations were actually student ideas generated in the Library Test Kitchen Design Studio. And as you see on this slide, they were turned into a playable deck of cards for the use of librarians, designers, and policymakers to get them out of their comfort zone, to provoke well-informed, historically informed, but imaginative discussion about what a library could be or should be in the 21st century. And the last chapter of this book looks like a chapter. It's a kind of epilogue entitled Cold Storage. And if you read these opening words, which are not are just the beginning, you're about to hear them in the film. This is the introduction to Alain René's Toute la mémoire du monde, his 1956 loving but very ironic, even subversive portrait of the National Library of France. It's one of René's really interesting early documentaries before he became a cinematic auteur. And following that, this little essay is a visual essay. Well, without telling our readers, Matthew and I had already imagined this as a draft of a script for a documentary. And I'm going to just show you the first couple of minutes of that documentary right now.
Parce que leur mémoire est courte, les hommes accumulent d'innombrables pense-bêtes.
Because their memory is short-lived, humans accumulate an infinity of memory aids.
Devant ces soutes pleines à craquer, les hommes prennent peur.
Confronted with the teeming warehouses that result, panic sets in. They fear being trampled by books, submerged beneath heaps of words. So to ensure their freedom, they erect formidable fortresses. In the era of Alain René's 1956 documentary, All the World's Memory, the fortress was the National Library of France, a place of on-site storage and retrieval, a temple where the living commune with the dead. In our era, it encompasses faraway stockhouses, off-site extensions of conventional reading rooms, libraries that can only be navigated by machine proxies. One such bastion is a high-density facility known as the Harvard Depository, or HD, wherein reside 9 million books, pamphlets, posters, papers, films, magnetic tapes, photographs, LPs, and microforms. 9 million items and counting.
10, 9, ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
So the film you were just watching is both a freestanding film. As you can see, it's actually a remix of Alain René's film. Even the words are actually reworked from the original script of René's film. But as you move through it, you actually move through another library, which is the archive of the storage facility, whose history it recounts. So there's this kind of interlaced structure that interested us, and that is an embodiment of a genre that's sometimes referred to as the database documentary, where one weaves together, in a sense, the kind of superabundance of the archive with the storytelling model of the documentary film. But what would once have ended up on the cutting floor is now part of a user-initiated experience that allows you to go way beyond the confines of the narrative that's been constructed for you. And this film has been shown, was premiered at the National Library of France, which of course is only appropriate since the René film was itself a kind of critical but loving portrait of that institution. So Cold Storage is a documentary film. It was connected to the Library Test Kitchen Design Studio, which I alluded to before. It assumes the form of what's sometimes referred to as a database documentary. It's connected, of course, to the book as well as to the card deck. And all of these projects have woven into them a series of research questions. They're the same research questions, but they express themselves in different ways. Questions like, what kind of place is a database? When we think about libraries, the roles that libraries and other kinds of learning sites play, those spaces, place, of course, is a decisive function in how and the specificity of the ways that they activate knowledge, that they serve as sites of learning. And some of the other questions are listed here. All of this is documented online. You're welcome to have a look at it beyond the confines of this talk. So I want to close here with the sort of MetaLab chapter by answering a slightly different question, which is how a museum experience can be enhanced via the experience of a database. And the focus here, as I think I'll try to show you, is to really try to go beyond the sorts of models that unfortunately have been becoming pretty ubiquitous in cultural spaces, where we insert a screen where there was once an analog art object. And we think that that's somehow adding value to an experience. This is an attempt to go far beyond that kind of model, to really think about how we can create experiences of digital artifacts that are unique, that are additive with respect, that add value with respect to the other experiences that are available to us. So the example in question is the so-called Lightbox Gallery, which is at the top floor of the Renzo Piano addition to the Harvard Art Museums, which was opened about 2 years ago. And this was kind of a piece of junk space. It was a leftover gallery, but it doesn't fulfill any of the necessities of a true gallery. It doesn't have the climate conditions. There's too much light. It's at the top of the greenhouse, and it overlooks over the back here the beautiful pseudo-Renaissance courtyard of the original Fogg Museum. So it's a kind of privileged location, but it's this slightly narrow, slightly ungainly space. And as MetaLab was commissioned to develop a solution for it, to try to do something that added value, added a dimension to the visitor experience. It's worth noting that visitors enter the museum and they go up through the galleries. So this is their destination, so to speak. This is not where they start, it's where they would end, having already seen the 1,803 objects that are exhibited as part of the permanent collection. And as I think you can see from this video, the solution we came up with was to create the initial experience, what we call the object map, a portrait of all 1,803 objects viewed simultaneously on one wall, and then on the opposite wall, a projection system, which causes any action, any object that's signaled with an air mouse to, and I'm going to show you that it's a little easier to see here. So you're facing all 1,800 objects. You point the air mouse at a single object. What do you get? You don't get just a representation of that object, which you already saw on your way up. You get that object treated as a digital object, a digital object that has other surrogates, not just one representation. If you click on the stack, you see any other representation that's part of the data set. Basically, you're looking into the provenance folder, into the registrar's folder. You're also seeing what one might describe as a data artifact. When you run machine vision or analytical tools on an image of a 10th century Chinese bronze, what do you get? It can't tell the difference between background and foreground. So the color distribution, of course, is artifactual in the sense of being inaccurate. So I'm going to mess with whoever is in the gallery right now, but maybe it's too late, so it's probably closed. So here we are in real time. We're just pulling live from the database of the Harvard Art Museums. You're having that experience, basically, of walking into the gallery. You're pulling up the, I'm going to move this down a little bit and actually downsize it so we can look at them together. And you can see what that experience looks like. Okay, so we'll pull this down a little bit, and we'll pull out a random object. Let's see, it's still loading, actually. It's a lot of data. Okay, and we pulled up a Chinese 12th, 11th century artifact. You can see color analysis, location, etc. But I'm leaving out of the picture what's really happening here, which is if we go back to our record here. Okay. By the way, many of the things that are exposed, like take this example of the duck, you can see things that are internal features that are not captured, not even visible to the eye. So what's happening on the projection screen? What's happening on the projection screen behind you is every time you pull up a record, you're seeing this object not, oh, I'm sorry, go back out there. There we go. Okay, there we go. All right, so let's go back to our object map. Okay, and let's look at a field like 12th century. Or let's look at the division that this belongs to. You can see, or let's look at accession year. The point of this kind of an installation is to create a fundamentally different kind of experience, which is to see a collection as a whole, to see each object within a collection as a network of relations. And that's a fundamentally different view than the view that you have that we don't want to compete with in the individual galleries. It's an attempt to build a kind of, as I was saying at the beginning of this talk, a kind of seam that expresses somehow something that goes beyond the face-to-face experience of the object, that adds value to it, that allows you to see things you can't see. So in closing here, I'm going to talk briefly about another set of challenges that connect up to, instead, to the work that Greg and I have been doing in Piaggio Fast Forward. And to answer, these are challenges that answer a fundamentally different set of questions. The first one is how human intelligence could enhance machine intelligence, how we could leverage the power of human intelligence to make machine intelligence more effective. And secondly, how could we do so in the service of moving better, further, and more sustainably? I touched upon some of the challenges that we've been facing, but I'm going to give you, by way of a conclusion here, just a kind of sense, an initial sense of some of the way our thinking has been shaped and how it's led us to certain kinds of solutions. And the first, I think, point that's essential to make is that very early in our own development process, we realized that in terms of the emerging spaces of mobility in contemporary life, the ones that were the least well served were the ones occupied by pedestrians. I mean, the 20th century was the century in which we sacrificed our cities on the altar of automobility. And as we have seen, increasingly, the role attributed to bicycles, skateboards, other kinds of forms of light mobility platforms, but also particularly to pedestrianism, suggests that there might be models where mechanical contrivances, vehicles endowed with the kinds of emerging forms of intelligence and vision and sensing capability could help us to move better and further in the world. So we started out really rethinking the usual privileging in discussions of mobility of streets to focus on sidewalks in particular. And there's one image that has continued to haunt us throughout this discussion, which is the so-called Hanoi Problem or the Mumbai Problem, or you can put your favorite developing world city. This is a task, a navigational task that is of unique complexity. The world that robots would like to see that the world that machine vision would require in order to render this kind of a situation legible is at a great remove from where we are today. Our cities today look much more like this than they do like perfect rectilinear grid structures with clearly demarcated zones of transit and so forth. Look at the way in which this pattern takes place. It includes animals, it includes humans riding 2-wheeled, 3-wheeled, 4-wheeled vehicles. It includes people carrying large objects. It includes trucks and cars. The traffic patterns and their efficiency make enormous demands upon our ability to anticipate the movements of others in this very complex dance. It's almost like a kind of stochastic phenomenon that we're looking at. So one of the things that we realized very early on was it was really important to scale down to a scale that really is the scale of humans, of how we as humans move around cities. And the DNA of our company helped us a lot, I think, in getting away from some of the more obvious and increasingly routine conversations about autonomy in relation to trucks and cars and large vehicles, and to focus on lightweight mobility, to focus on the DNA of the Vespa and the Ape, its workhorse equivalent, and to really think of the space that we wanted to explore and to develop for as somewhere in between even the smallest autonomous four-wheeled vehicles and somehow different from aerial drones. A kind of land drone space, if you like, or a land droid space. And secondly, to emphasize the role of human agents in these spaces. To simply replace the old monarch of the transportation system, the automobile and the truck, with a kind of 21st century descendant didn't seem like a very rich proposition about what the future of cities ought to look like. So our thought from the beginning was mobility should somehow encourage pedestrianism or light travel of the sort that skateboarders and cyclists are engaged in. And that led us fairly early in our development process to get interested in following the idea that robotic agents, rather than sending them out into the world to displace acts of pedestrianism, walking, wandering, shopping, delivering, traveling, that it would be more interesting to start thinking about what can they do for us? How can we leverage their abilities? And the slogan we ended up coming up with is autonomy for humans. You might say humans already have autonomy. Why do they need autonomy? Well, the point is autonomy in the service of humans. How can we create vehicle types that expand human capabilities, that carry things that we can't carry, that would lead us not to walk, that follow us to leverage our intelligence as navigators of complex environments? And so the design of Gita and Kilo, you're seeing Gita is the little spherical kind of BB-8-like vehicle. Kilo is the cargo big brother that carries, it's a 3-wheeler, carries up to 250 pounds. Gita is a cargo bot that carries 40 pounds. The design of them is deliberately oriented towards mimicking the ease, the agility with which humans move around the world. You'll notice Gita is self-balancing. You can walk forward or backward. When you drive a vehicle like this, it's fundamentally different than driving the vehicles you're used to, where you're always thinking about vehicle dynamics. What can the vehicle do? What's its turning radius? Gita turns on a dime. It has a 0 turning radius. It moves like you do. So to be invisibly tethered to a vehicle like this is a fundamentally different proposition than it is to push a shopping cart or to pull a trolley or to do anything of the kind. And also within that universe of very intuitive command and control, if you like, is the fact that these are vehicles that live like you do, inside and out. They can cross those kinds of thresholds between the outdoor sort of civic, public spaces and indoor private or commercial spaces. And that includes being able to serve, and eventually to take elevators and to maneuver and navigate buildings, architectural structures of every kind, as soon as door controls and elevator controls are integrated into a wireless network. And within that set of choices, of course, it's essential that one not depend upon global positioning satellite data. These are vehicles that that use VSLAM, comparative VSLAM, an optical, a visual-based navigation system. And as they travel, they map. They produce data. They produce very fine-grained mapping data of the physical spaces they travel, and it's on the basis of that data that waypoints can be established by an operator, and they can be sent off on autonomous missions. But you'll notice we put human guidance in the lead. We try to leverage the power of human guidance and make autonomy a secondary, however powerful, a secondary function. I'm going to stop here by just showing you the overall vision within which this work falls.